military, if you want to call them that, fought against them. And as a result, there was like a vacuum there. And they ended up actually having a period of freedom with none of the other dominant powers occupying them for a while. All kinds of, questions of why, what was, were they out of the way, not really that important, that it wasn't that interesting. But in any case, once things got rough, though, they invited a new power in the West to come to their aid, and they joined with a kind of a contract with them. These were the Romans. And so the Romans were invited to come in as allies. And the Romans came in, and they did, in fact, keep the enemies out, which was nice. But the Romans also wanted order in their empire, and they had a lot of trouble with the Jewish people. So eventually they decided to set up an authority there that would kind of try to keep order there. And of course, we end up hearing, of course, about Pontius Pilate as the procurator at the time of Jesus' birth. So they're occupied at that time, and their goal was to be free once again. And so the Messiah that they were looking for was really a military Messiah that would, free them from the occupation. Now Jesus, of course, arrives, and what do we know about him? Well, the main sources of that's not the... So the Synopticon. Synopticon means one view, right? So even though they're not exactly one, they're close. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke. First of these was Mark. Mark seems to have been written, I think, around AD 50 or so. I'm old and I'm forgetting, so if you remember stuff better than me, it's all out there, so you can look it all up. But so Mark seems to have been the first to write, although this is a gospel. The other is Paul, is really the one that first started to write, but he wrote letters initially. So Paul is considered to be the first one to write stories about Jesus. And what he's doing is actually quoting things being said about Jesus. So the folks that have worked on these documents believe that there was an oral tradition. The people that knew Jesus and remembered him told stories about him. And as they were telling these stories about him, eventually they started writing things down. And Paul was also actively converting people that were Gentiles. And so he was quoting from the oral stories, so we get some of that in his letters. But Mark is considered to be the first gospel, and the interesting thing that's kind of the theme in Mark is that Mark is trying to see if I can remember how this goes. Mark is kind of a Jewish Christian group, and what happens that we usually don't hear about is from the death of Jesus on, there's a lot of Jewish groups that actually are Christian. They believe in Jesus, but at the same time they don't believe Jesus is divine. He's a prophet for them, but he's not God, right? And by the way, Muhammad grew up in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula area where there were Jewish Christian groups. So it's believed that Muhammad grows up with Jewish Christian groups that believe Jesus is a prophet, the same way that he does, but not divine, right? So you get an interesting interconnection there. And there were lots of these. Ethiopia had Christian Jewish groups and so on. So there's Jewish Christian groups all over, with different kinds of beliefs, different emphasis, on him. But Mark seems to be especially fighting against the rabbis. And so the question is, okay, well, why is this something that's happening? Well, this is after the first revolt of the Jewish people against Rome. And Rome destroyed the temple and famously surrounded, what's the name of that desert fortress? Masada? It's still there. It's still, whenever the Israeli graduates in the military celebrate their graduation, they all have a ceremony at Masada. That's the fortress. Let me go find that. I don't know where. Find. Okay, so there's a good image of Masada. So this was built probably by Herod the Great as a fortress to guard the kingdom from enemies coming in from the Dead Sea area, and the rebels went there, fled there. It was well stocked with arms and food and all sorts of things. And it took the Romans 4 years to destroy them. And the odd result of it was that in order to attack the fortress, it's, as you can see up on one of the mesas or whatever you want to call those, the Romans literally had to build a ramp all the way up to the walls, and so it took them 4 years to do. And if you archaeologically dig in the area, you can see where the Roman camps were for all that time and how they did it. And once they finally built the ramp all the way up, and they were getting ready to storm the fortress, and they entered into the fortress, there was nobody there. They had all committed suicide. So rather than yield to the Romans, the people there had committed suicide. Although there's all kinds of controversies. Yes?
What was the motivation to still do it for like 4 years? And how did the people in the fort have food?
They had food and water. It was a fortress that had storage areas that could have lasted for years, for even thousands of soldiers. But they were actually not that. They were quite few. It was families and children. Right? But there's all kinds of things about it. The Israelis are very proud of the fortress and the history of those people, etc. But so the Romans destroyed the temple and chased at least many of the Jewish people away. And if you think about it, the focus of life for the Jewish community was the temple. The high priests who ran the temple were the ones that were the main religious authorities. And once the temple was destroyed, they didn't have a job anymore. So instead of the priesthood becoming the main authority, it became the local community teachers, the rabbis, who were the Pharisees. So they become the head of the religious authority for the people that are wandering in the various communities, right? They don't have temples anymore. They have synagogues. Synagogue is essentially the same word as ecclesia, which is the Greek word for synagogue, which actually synagogue is Greek. so I don't know what I'm talking about, actually. But
What's
it means
the
church.
difference between a temple and a synagogue?
The temple is where they would sacrifice animals. Synagogues, you don't have any animal sacrifice. You
Is
just-
that for only?
Pardon?
Is it like shaped a certain way, or is it just they just call it?
Yes, the temple was designed, originally in Exodus, they were given directions on how to build the tent. And when they settled in and built an actual temple, they built it on the same design as that. Yes.
So you said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all synoptic. Why isn't John included in that? Because I was always told they were kind of like a package deal.
Yeah. Well, I should get back to that, how that worked, right? Because Mark apparently is written at the time where the Jewish people were kicked out of the temple. And so you now have these rabbis who are the head of the Jewish communities. But you also have these Jewish Christian groups who are trying to basically convert everyone to join them, right? And so the conflict among the Jewish people becomes between the rabbi-led groups and the Christian-led groups, right? And so Mark, being written at about then, is basically depicting Jesus as in conflict with the rabbis, having arguments with rabbis. And so Mark essentially seems to be a gospel that was written for that particular time to encourage the Christian Jewish groups to not be interested in becoming one of the followers of the rabbis and to convert the those followers of the rabbis. But it ends with Jesus crucified, and he's laid in the tomb, and then at the very end, and they open the tomb, he's gone. And that's the end of it. It doesn't go anywhere else, right? But when you get to Matthew comes along, and now the conflict between the Jewish Christians and the Jews that are following the rabbis is even greater and more significant, and as a result, the conflict becomes even greater in the conflict between Jesus and those. But Luke is interesting because Luke is actually written, but they're all, you find them all in Greek, in Koine Greek. When I was in college, the Greek I took was called Koine, which means kind of the common Greek. So it's not the literary Greek, it's instead the common Greek. And Mark is actually in that common language, and so is Matthew. But Luke apparently was a doctor and educated, and he wrote beautiful Greek. And he's not considered to be, so these are traditions. So a lot of people think, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the apostles. Well, they're actually traditions. This is the Matthew tradition. Was Matthew one of the apostles, the one who wrote it? No, he didn't write. But whoever did start writing the tradition was probably pulling on stories that might have been from Matthew. Who knows, right? But in any case, you end up with the life of Jesus in these stories, right? So they don't just write about what happened to Jesus. They start giving you, the story about being born in Bethlehem, and the angels and all heralding your birth and all of this, and so it becomes kind of a narrative. And Luke is much more even that. In fact, some scholars refer to it as kind of a romance, because it's got all these elements of an interesting story in it. So it's fun to read as opposed to just being, a sayings gospel. What they do think, though, is that all three of the Synopticon are based on a particular oral tradition that they refer to as the source, or the Quelle, which in German means the source, and so they often refer to it as the Q document, although there is no such document. But they're assuming that what enabled all of these synopticon stories, even though they're written in different places and included different aspects of the tradition, they're nonetheless similar enough that they seem to be quoting